This is a video lecture for HKIN 456, Exercise and Fitness Evaluation at St. Francis Xavier University. This is the midterm review lecture, and we'll cover briefly the main concepts that we've outlined in the class so far and discuss how we apply those in the context of cardiorespiratory exercise specifically. Now, fitness and exercise evaluation is so important at this point in time because so many people need fitness and exercise evaluative services. 2 in 3 adults are currently overweight. This trend is on the upswing in young individuals as well, in kids. And in kids and adults, 50% don't meet the strength and fitness guidelines. 50% don't meet both sets of guidelines. And this inactivity that is so rampant and prevalent in society has far-reaching implications. Of course, reduced physical activity can lead to becoming overweight and lead to obesity. This can have associated comorbidities, including impaired blood pressure, altered lipid profiles, coronary heart disease, diabetes. Eventually that can result in hyperglycemia and neuropathy and different kinds of diseases that shorten lifespan. Muscle weakness and bone fractures are another side effect of not exercising regularly, simply from not using those systems. And we're starting to realize now that there are a lot of psychological effects of not exercising, including depression and anxiety. And the reverse is true too. If we do exercise, we can reverse all of these things. At minimum, the amount of exercise that we would like people to partake in terms of aerobic and muscular strengthening exercise, is at least 150 minutes a week of moderate aerobic exercise or 75 minutes per week of vigorous intensity aerobic exercise. These two are interchangeable. They don't both have to be met. And for muscular strengthening exercise, we'd like to see at least 2 days a week of some kind of resistance type exercise. These are the minimum guidelines to provide adequate base of fitness. These aren't the guidelines, however, that will alter body composition and manage weight. These are the minimum physical activity guidelines to promote health. Ideally, we would like to see double that prescription. We'd like to see people doing a lot more exercise. Generally, the benefits scale with the amount of exercise performed. And certainly to control and manage body weight, we need to see 300 minutes or more a week of moderate intensity aerobic exercise, 150 minutes or more per week of vigorous intensity exercise, and we'd like to see at least 4 days a week of resistance type exercise. Now, regardless of the type of exercise that you choose to partake in, there are some guidelines that we need to adhere to in preparation for the exercise, in preparation for the tests, in preparation for any exercise prescription. These are guidelines, these are common threads that we need to be able to perform in order to protect ourselves as exercise specialists. So the steps, the 4 basic minimal screening steps that we need to employ in every single assessment that we do are PAR-Q, Physical Activity Readiness Questionnaire, possibly the PAR-Med-X if the PAR-Q indicates that the PAR-Med-X should be completed. This would be done by a physician and not by you specifically. We need to evaluate the medical questionnaire, so any non-apparent incidences of disease that might be contraindications to exercise. We want to try to bring those out with the med questionnaire. We'll assess the coronary heart disease risk profile and use lifestyle evaluation questionnaires to give context to help inform our prescription, assuming that the exercise that we would like to partake in, or that we would like our clients to partake in, will be accepted well. And then finally, we have to classify in terms of low, moderate, and high disease risk. And this will inform what intensity we're allowed to start out with and how we progress through the training program, and whether we need to do a graded exercise test as part of our initial assessment. Regardless of the type of test that we use, we have established tests. We can make our own tests. We've gone through an example of that. These tests should be valid, reliable, and objective. Any assessments of physical activity, any test that you want to employ to measure percent body fat or cardiorespiratory ability, or anything that is an indirect measure of some more important variable, needs to be valid, needs to be reliable, and needs to be objective. So in this example, a fence post is 3 feet tall. All of these fence posts are around 3 feet tall. They're consistently 3 feet tall. And then not only would I say that, but my neighbor would say that as well. Valid, reliable, and objective. Throughout the assessments that we do, and even during the exercise programs, sometimes you'll have to monitor specific physiological variables. Things like heart rate and blood pressure are common. ECGs, not as common. RPE, very easy to get. VO2, another one that is a bit more involved. There's a certain order to these assessments that we would have to keep in place while we're exercising. We should know how to administer these different assessments. And note that in some cases, this might throw you off a little bit, but in some cases, resting measurements are more difficult than exercise. For blood pressure, for example, rest would be more difficult than exercise in trying to get accurate results, because the heart isn't pumping as forcefully at rest. It might be more difficult to hear the cough sounds in the artery. That might make it more difficult at rest than during exercise. But on the other hand, because heart rate increases so much, and because we can't occlude the artery for so long during exercise, we need to take that measurement quickly during exercise. We'd like to get an assessment of blood pressure over 30 seconds during exercise. And so that required time frame might make that assessment more difficult during exercise than during rest. So think about how some of these might be difficult in each situation and which ones are universally easy. When we've made our assessment, when we've determined our person's cardiorespiratory ability, whether it's through a predictive equation, whether it's through a standardized protocol, or whether it's through a protocol that we made ourselves, we have to adhere to 7 principles of program design. These are true for any situation, for any person, for any mode, but they'll be different for each person that you assess. That's rolled up in the principle of specificity. It's different for every person, and your prescription will be different based on the mode that you choose to prescribe. So this is why we like to assess in a similar mode to our prescription. Overload states simply that the system can only adapt when you add a stress, something that is not normally handled by the system. Adaptation comes from stressing the system. Principle of progression indicates that in order to continue to have an adaptation, you have to increase the stress over time. Initial values state that based on where your person starts, the adaptation will be relative. The same stress won't provide the same adaptation in a very unfit individual as it would in a very fit individual. The initial values will dictate the type of adaptation that a certain prescription will bring about. Diminishing returns indicates that you must continue to increase the stress over time, but there is a certain ceiling, a certain limit to the adaptation that we can bring about. to the returns that we can expect to see in a given program or at all. We as humans can't continue to improve forever. The principle of variability says that some people will respond to the same stress in different ways. And then reversibility is essentially underload. It's the negative image of principle number 2, overload. If you reduce the stress below the level that the body is used to or the system is used to, that underwhelming stress will tend to reverse any gains that we've observed. Now, so if these are the blueprints, these are the rules that we have to follow in order to design a program. The tools that we use to design that program are the FitVP tools. Frequency, intensity, time or duration, type or mode of exercise, volume of exercise, and then progression. These are the things that we outline in our prescription. These are the ingredients that make up our prescription. Not only can we prescribe exercise and progress our clients through a program, we also have to realize that the job that we do isn't done there. We have to be able to encourage and support during that program. There are a number of different motivational theories that we talked about. Some of them tend to overlap. They all tend to describe how likely a person is to adopt an exercise program. How likely they are to adopt that program, and it informs how you can involve them in the process to make them more likely to adopt that program. So I won't go through each of these in series. They all tend to deal in some respect with motivation. Is your client motivated by fear? Are they motivated by intrinsic health benefits? Do they need to be encouraged to perform exercise? Are they intrinsically motivated? Do they have the intention to act, or are they being forced into it? All of these things will help determine the likelihood that they will continue in your program, that they'll be able to support themselves in the program. We also talked about how technology can be powerful motivation. We have a lot of different ways that we can assess different variables in different free living situations, and this information can be really powerful for some people. It really helps them see progress and take ownership over the program. And so incorporating technology could be, and likely will be, one of the main next steps in the evolution of fitness assessment and evaluation. Technology can be a powerful motivator. It certainly also allows you to monitor more frequently and at a distance and in an unbiased way. Now, the application of these rules, weaving that common thread together, specifically for cardiorespiratory exercise, goes as follows. When we assess the cardiorespiratory fitness of our person, what we're talking about is maximal VO2. The maximal ability to take up, transport, and use oxygen. This is our gold standard measure of aerobic fitness, or of cardiovascular fitness. In order to measure this, there are certain criteria that we have to follow. We have to have our client work as hard as they possibly can. It has to be at an aerobic intensity. And the way that we do that is to progress them through a series of incremental workloads to volitional exhaustion. We also want to be thinking ahead here in terms of the prescription that we would like to invoke for our client so that we assess in a similar mode. We saw how heart rate was variable at the same intensity for a number of different exercises, indicating that the stress by those exercises was not the same. And so we'd like to assess in the same mode that we will be prescribing exercise. In measuring VO2 max, there are a number of ways that we talked about that we can assess VO2 max. they're not all equally good. If we had to establish a hierarchy, the best way to assess cardiorespiratory fitness would be to measure VO2 max via a graded exercise test. A complete test all the way to exhaustion. This is the best way to assess cardiorespiratory exercise. If we couldn't get the machines working, if we didn't have a VO2 system, if we couldn't analyze oxygen consumption via a METcart, we could estimate via the final workload that we achieved on a graded exercise test. We have predictive equations that relate intensity to VO2, and so that is a fairly good surrogate in that situation. If we didn't have the ability to put our client through an exhaustive protocol, we could predict from validated protocols. We could use predetermined graded exercise tests. We could use single or two-stage predictive tests. We have equations, we have tables. We could use these things to predict VO2 max in our client. Now, it's difficult to say for sure that this is the third best and not the fourth best. The third and fourth options here can really be interchanged. The only reason that the fourth option is listed as fourth is that it involves prediction of VO2 max, and it also involves prediction of heart rate. So the fourth option would be to predict from submaximal graded exercise test data, where we get a few data points and then we project up to the projected maximal heart rate, and then calculate VO2 max according to that expected maximum heart rate. There's error here because we have to predict VO2 max, but also an individual's max heart rate will not be the same based on their age, fitness level, etc. There is extra inherent error built into that assessment as well. So when we develop a program for cardiorespiratory exercise specifically, we'd like frequency to be somewhere in the 5 times per week for moderate, 3 times per week for vigorous exercise. Moderate is an average intensity. That's 3 to 6 METs, or around 60-65% of VO2 reserve, or VO2 max. Think about when we've talked about those being relatively interchangeable. Also think about what is not interchangeable in terms of reserve and max. There was one measurement that was not interchangeable. Vigorous is over 6 METs, or around 80% VO2 reserve. We'd like the exercise to take 20 to 60 minutes, depending on the intensity and depending on the frequency. We've dictated ways already that we can calculate this from the volume that we lay out for our weekly program. We can estimate this, or we can actually calculate an exact number to match the volume that we would like to have for our clients in every week. The type of exercise we want to be dynamic. It has to be rhythmic. It has to be constant repetitive contraction that is cardiorespiratory exercise. And it has to be appropriate to skill level or to fitness level. So somebody that's not very fit will start with something that doesn't require much skill, doesn't require a lot of balance, that just provides a good baseline fitness. And then as you progress, your client can be involved in more and more cardiorespiratory sports, things that might not be as boring, that might still engage them in the program. The volume we can assess in a number of different ways. Some are more appropriate and better assessments than others. We can simply assess the number of minutes of exercise performed per week. MET minutes will include some idea of the intensity as well. And then kcals is a really nice way to include frequency, intensity, time, etc. The total extra energy that was expended in that week. So an example of progression might be that we start our client off at 60% of VO2 reserve for 30 minutes or so every time they exercise, and this will last for the first 6 weeks. This is the initial fitness development stage. Next, we can expect that over 4 to 8 months, based on the prescription that we give our client, a 20 to 30% increase in VO2 max. And the third stage that we would have to accommodate in our prescription, in our progression, is the inclusion of sports and activities that enhance their enjoyment and keep them engaged in the program. So these aren't specific examples of progression, but they are the phases that you have to go through when prescribing cardiorespiratory exercise. So I'll go through another quick example with you guys, and this is something of a personal nature that I would try to partake in if I were to assess myself and prescribe cardiorespiratory exercise. I like to cycle, and so if I were to train, I would train maybe not for competitive cycling, but for more avid cycling. I'd like to see an increase of 20 to 30% VO2 max. I'd like to be able to measure VO2 max and then also have assessments of VO2 and heart rate that I can use in my prescription. So the data that I've collected in this example is certainly not data that I can produce right now. This is data from a while ago. Resting VO2 and resting heart rate, maximal VO2 and maximal heart rate are shown here. From this data, I can calculate VO2 reserve. I can also calculate heart rate reserve. And then when I want to prescribe exercise, all I need to do is take the appropriate percentage of those reserves. So my frequency will start at 4 days a week, progress towards 6 days a week, which is fairly ambitious, I must say. Good thing this is a theoretical program. The intensity, I'd like to include a mix of moderate and vigorous intensity exercise. So in my moderate bouts, I'm shooting for 65% of heart rate reserve. This is a good moderate intensity workload. This is also the workload where we tend to maximize energy provision from fat. Great moderate intensity target. The vigorous intensity exercise, I'm going to aim for 85% of heart rate reserve. This will give me a bit of room to increase over time up towards 90, maybe 95%, depending on the type of vigorous activity I'd like to do. The time requirements will be an hour initially for my moderate intensity, 40 minutes initially for my vigorous intensity exercise. I'd like to be able to do outdoor cycling for my moderate intensity exercise. So I'll need a heart rate number that I can train to. And then indoors for the interval training, for the vigorous training, I'll be on an ergometer so I can use a workload, a watt measurement. I'd like to progress towards 300 minutes per week of moderate intensity and also 150 minutes per week of vigorous intensity. This, I'm realizing now, is quite a tall order. This will be what I shoot for at the end of my prescription. Combining these two together is crazy, to say the least. And then my progression will be gradual improvement over 4 months. So my prescription will initially be for 4 months. I'll give it in 4-week blocks, and then we can see the gradual progression over time in both the moderate and the high intensity interval cases. So the proposal might look something like this to start. So in my first 4 weeks, month number 1, I'm training 2 days per week in both cases. The moderate intensity exercise is targeted to 60 to 65% VO2 max, of heart rate reserve or VO2 reserve. This equates to 128 to 135 beats per minute. This intervals section, this column doesn't apply here. I'm training for 60 minutes, so in total, 2 days a week, I'll be training for 120 minutes a week. High intensity interval training over the first month, again, 2 days a week. These are on opposite days, so in total, I'm training Monday, Tuesday, Wednesdays off, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday is off. The pattern of exercise will be 80% to start of heart rate reserve. The intensity in my resting periods between intervals is going to be just passive rest. But I only have a heart rate prescription here for the workload because I can't target a heart rate during rest. Whatever it happens to drop to is fine, but I want to at least target 154 beats per minute. It's very likely that this will increase, that I'll target or I'll hit a heart rate above this target, but I want to get at least 154 beats per minute. The intervals that I'll do to start are 6 in total of 4 minutes on, 2 minutes off, for a total of 36 minutes per session, 72 minutes per week. Now, if I progress through the exercise, a typical progression might look something like this, where for my moderate intensity exercise prescription, I've increased the frequency to 1 day a week. I've limited excessive increases in frequency because I also have to accommodate the high intensity bouts. So I can't work out 7 or 9 days a week. I only want to increase this by 1 initially. The intensity, I don't increase right away. Near the end of my program in the 4th month, I do increase this to 70-75%. What does change is the total session time and the total time per week. So I go from 120 minutes per week to 180 to 270 based on the increase in frequency first and then total time per bout second. Notice this is approaching my 300 minute per week target. Hopefully at this point I've established a fairly significant base of fitness and this isn't inappropriate. For the high intensity interval training, I also don't tend to increase the frequency too much. I am increasing the intensity slightly by increasing the workload that I perform during the breaks. Instead of passive rest, I cycle lightly at 50% of heart rate reserve. Now I have a heart rate prescription. My work to rest ratio stays the same, but I include more intervals as I progress through the program. This tends to increase time spent per bout, and then notice that the total time per week performing high intensity training also increases. 72 minutes, 96 minutes in the 2nd month, 120 and 180 by the 4th month of training. Now, I have not included an assessment of the energetic facet of volume. The intensity is not incorporated into this measurement of volume. So I don't have an idea of METs or kcals, but you can calculate this. Using the VO2 data on the last slide, you can figure out what percent of VO2 reserve I would be working at in each of these cases. Knowing that, you could calculate the intensity. You could calculate the caloric equivalence based on the standard constant that we know for VO2. 1 liter represents 5 kcals of energy being consumed. So it's possible to extend this progression, this program, and assess MET minutes per week or kcals per week and get a value for that volume. I'll leave that as an exercise for you guys to do on your own. And so that is the end of our midterm review lecture. If you guys have questions as you go through, please email me and let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you on Wednesday for the midterm. Best of luck studying.